Hello everyone, welcome back to class. This week, we'll be looking into the topic, international politics, with the motion, this House believes that veto power should be moved from UN Security Council. Now, this is a topic that goes very well with nuclear weapons debate we did last time as well, because we're dealing with how we ensure peace in our world. Of course, if you're a history junkie or have participated in Model United Nations, you would really like this topic. But even if you don't know anything about history or Model United Nations yet, don't worry. I will explain to you step by step in this video for you. So we all first start off by understanding what is United Nations. In the beginning of 20th century, we saw two big wars where countries fought against each other, resulting in millions of people dying, and that was World War I and World War II. In 1945, the World War II finally ended with 70 to 85 million people dead and leaving many nations in ruins, just like what you see in this picture. The world had enough of wars and they badly wanted peace. As a result, 51 countries gathered together in San Francisco that year to sign a document that we call a charter, which basically explains about how countries will now work together and do not fight again. Now that the charter is signed, we need some sort of organization, a club, you may say, to make sure this charter is properly working. And that was the birth of United Nations, short for UN. The picture you see on the bottom is a UN headquarters in New York City. I strongly recommend that one day you visit here. So you may or may have not heard about UN, but I can tell you they do a lot of things to make the world a better place for everyone. In the beginning, there were countries still in big and small wars, and UN sent peacekeeping armies so normal people like you and me won't get hurt or caught up in between wars. But UN also do a lot of activity works in humanitarian aid, such as giving out food and necessity to poor areas, and more importantly, ensuring everyone is treated fairly and humanely in the world, so that kids can get proper education. More importantly, UN is also actively engaged in battling climate change around the world. So you can say they do a lot of good things for the world. Now, if you're going to do a lot of good things, then you need a big organization with many sub-clubs. Just like a big sports club where you'll see soccer club, tennis clubs, and gymnastics club, UN has many sub-organizations such as UN Security Council, General Assembly, UN Human Rights Council, and so on. And one organization that we'll be debating about today would be the Security Council. The United Nations Security Council, or UNSC for short, is one of the 6 principal organizations of United Nations, and it's made out of 15 countries, which I will talk about in a minute. And they are charged with ensuring international peace and security. They are there because they want to make sure no countries are fighting, just like the police. Now, if you want countries to stop fighting and you want to be like a police to make them listen to you, you need power. UNSC powers include establishing peacekeeping operation, sending militaries, enacting international sanctions, and authorizing military actions. Sanctions, in easy words, it means yes, they can send military if there is a conflict, and if you don't listen to them or if you don't listen to international rules and act weird or very violent, they can isolate you by not trading anything with you, so you don't have any money as a country. So having these superpowers, whenever there is a conflict like war in some place, UN Security Council members come together and they come up with a plan to stop that conflict or war. That plan of action is called resolution, something that all members of UN must follow so they can stop that war. Something like a promise that we will do something. So in a nutshell, you can understand that UN Security Council is the most powerful organization in UN. The next question is, then who are in this UN Security Council club? The Security Council consists of 15 members, of which 5 are permanent, which are China, France, Russia, UK, and the United States of America. These are the great powers, the victors of World War II. If you remember from the nuclear weapons debate, these 5 countries are also part of NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is having right to possess nuclear weapons. But it is not just nuclear weapons that these 5 countries have. These 5 members of Permanent Security Council members can veto any resolution. So what does that mean? It means, say there's a war in a country and a Security Council members come up together and come up with a resolution. But for example, UN, US, one of the permanent member don't like this resolution, so they decide to veto it. Then the resolution will not be activated. So you can see veto is basically having power to say no to a solution that was given by Security Council. And this power to say no are only given to the 5 member states, US, China, Russia, France, and UK. No one else can say no. So are you starting to see a problem? Due to veto power, some countries will always veto on certain issues. Like US will always veto any resolution on Israel and Palestine fight, while Russia will always veto any issues dealing with Syria, making it impossible for any solution to really come into place. In fact, these 5 members of Security Council vetoed a lot. Since 1992, it was almost, think about it, 250 resolutions were sent to trash bin because of vetoing. While some say these veto is very unfair, you can think of it the other way as well. These countries that veto the most happens to pay for most of the peacekeeping forces. If you're the ones paying the most support, you can also say you should also have the most right to say what to do with money you contributed. Others can also say that if you take away veto of the 5 countries, then the Power 5 will not participate on any works of UN, and no countries will be willing to work together. In other words, veto was the reason why these countries came together to work in UN in the first place. Giving the power to the ones who have the most responsibility seems like a logical thing. So having that in mind, let's go into the arguments of the motion. The motion says, this House believes that veto power should be removed from UN Security Council. So US, Russia, France, UK, and China will no longer be able to say no to a resolution. The value you can say from the pro side is that yes, equity is important and so is fairness. If countries come together in UN, and they should all be treated equally and they should have the same right. First argument you can say is that the veto is completely disregarding democracy. Democracy means each person has one vote. And in UN, it should be translated into each country should have one vote, no more. But if you give extra veto power saying, no, I don't want this, to these 5 nations, then that's no longer a proper democracy. Secondly, you can say the veto prolongs and escalates global conflicts. What do I mean by this? If, say, Israel and Palestine is at war, And every time the UN Security Council come out with a plan to stop this war, and US will just say veto, veto, veto all the time, then you're going to not see any peace in Israel and Palestine. Same for Syria. You see all the bombings in Syria, and people from Syria are becoming refugees and trying to get away from their country. But Russia, whenever the UN comes to say, let's do something about Syria, and Russia will say, no, I'll veto it all the time, then you will never see these global conflicts or war being resolved. So there's never going to be peace due to veto power. You can also say veto completely undermines the developing countries. What about poor countries? Just because they're poor or small doesn't mean that they don't have any right to say in these wars. You're only giving the voice to these 5 nations, and you're completely ignoring the small countries or poor countries in the first place. Lastly, you can also give an alternative. If you really have to have veto power, then you should give it to all countries or more countries to reduce and the opposition can say, oh, in this case, instead of removing it, let's just give veto power to more nations like Japan, Korea, Germany, who pays the most. But if you extend the UN Security Council veto power, then you will completely reduce the effectiveness, because more countries saying no to a resolution would probably mean that UN will probably not be able to resolve any of the wars, because all the veto power will just increase. Think about nuclear weapons. If everyone has it, then the world will become a less safer place. Just like that, if you give veto power to more countries, then there is never going to be peace in this world. Now let's go to the arguments of the con side. Disregarding all the problems of veto power, why should con side say that we should still have veto power in Security Council? Well, the value that comes from the con side, you can say, look, it is fair for the ones who are paying the most or has the most responsibility. They should be able to have bigger power to say what to do in UN. It is also the duty of these 5 nations to keep the world into the orderly place. And therefore, if UN is to work as an organization, we should keep this veto power, although it's not perfect. The first reason is that UN Security Council cannot survive without veto power. To be honest, these 5 nations have the most power in the world, and it's very difficult to come up with these countries to sit in one place and to have a negotiation or any sort of talk about wars. Without veto power, these 5 nations will never talk to each other. So UN Security Council without veto power will just be gone forever. That really means that the only police organization in UN will be completely gone forever. Secondly, veto power creates fair resolution that all members will agree. Without veto power, some resolution will be unfair for, let's say, China, or unfair for Russia, or unfair for US. And veto power at least have some resolution that all members will agree on, and therefore allowing all countries to work together. Third argument is that UN power does not offer, or UN charter, does not offer sovereign equality. Remember the charter that the country signed in 1945? The meaning of the UN charter, it doesn't mean that every country will have same power. It means that even though every country do not have same power, they will work together to have peace. So you can also say that UN is not really a country, so it's not really a democracy. And therefore, having veto power for the ones who are the most powerful and has the most responsibility only sounds fair, because UN was never a country in the first place, so there shouldn't be any democracy. Lastly, you can also say veto power
okay, maybe having 5 is maybe too much. So maybe you want to extend to more countries. If you go back to the countries who pay the most, like Germany, Japan, or South Korea, you can also say that these countries should also have a right to have veto power. So you can design Security Council in a way to say, look, why don't you extend the veto power to all 15 nations? Or you can say, why don't you give veto power to the nations who pay the most? In that way, countries who wants to have veto power will pay more so that they can contribute more for the peacekeeping forces, and as a result, because they have more responsibility, they will have more right, which is the veto power. This is all about fairness. So if you're the one paying the most, you should have the most power as well. That's the argument from the con side. Okay, so these were the arguments from both pro and con. So my suggestion is, why don't you have a read about in the reading packet? And until then, come researched, and I will see you in the debate. Thank you for listening to my video. Bye-bye.